Barry B. Brooks was a man known throughout Memphis, Tennessee as an adventurer. And, unlike some of the influencers who brand themselves as adventurers on today's social media, Brooks lived up to the title. Even today, if you talk to a longtime Memphis resident, you might hear them tell a story or two about Brooks's trophy room, a room that held the spoils of his African safaris and the weird trinkets and relics he had picked up while traveling the world. All this to say, when Barry Brooks found himself browsing rare and antique books in Paris during the late 1940s, it was entirely in line with his persona. It was one book in particular that captured Brooks's attention, a book dated 1608 with a cover that was beginning to separate from its spine. Noticing his interest, the bookseller let him know that he was right to take interest in this particular item, because it was right up the alley of a man like Brooks, with his love for the exotic and the rare. This book, you see, was bound in human skin. Welcome to the Forgotten Archive. I'm Dr. Perry Neal Harrison, and I'll be your curator and guide as we explore some of the strangest, most surprising, and most controversial written works ever created. Along the way, we'll examine the details that make these artifacts so extraordinary, as well as delve into the fascinating minds of the people and cultures who made these books. But remember, sometimes a book's cover has its own story. Anthropodermic Bibliopegy, the technical term for binding books in human skin, holds a special place in our minds. Certainly, skin-bound books are a staple in popular culture. As you no doubt know, these kinds of books are a common trope in works of popular fiction. They appear on television in TV series like Supernatural, in movies like the Evil Dead series and Hocus Pocus, and in the literary works of the horror novelist H.P. Lovecraft, a name we will be revisiting again during this podcast. And why wouldn't it capture our imagination? What could signify evil and malevolence better than the violence and unpleasantness that a book made out of a person themselves suggests? But these kinds of books can't be real, can they? The answer to this is, of course, more complicated than we would like. So complicated, in fact, that it will take 2 episodes to look at the whole story. And to get to the bottom of this, we'll need to, if you can forgive the pun, do a little bit of digging beneath the surface. For many people, the word medieval conjures up thoughts of brutality, torture, and a life that is violent and short. It is, after all, Marcellus Wallace's threat in the 1994 film Pulp Fiction to go medieval that drives home just how ugly things are about to get for his abductors, and the popularity of dark fantasy fiction with pseudo-medieval settings like George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and Kentaro Miura's Berserk helped to popularize this idea to the public. As someone who makes his living teaching and writing about the Middle Ages, I take some issue with this representation, but I can certainly understand how one might get a certain impression about the time period. With this in mind, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if you automatically assumed that many anthropodermic books come from the Middle Ages, but this is actually not the case. As a matter of fact, not a single scientifically verified example of a skin-bound book made during the Middle Ages exists, at least that I have found in my research. But facts haven't, of course, stopped people's imaginations. Lawrence Thompson, one of the first researchers to study skin-bound books, points to a 13th century French Bible as the earliest example of the skin-bound genre. And, truth be told, there's not much out there about this book. But this book does point to a trend that will keep cropping up. Books that are bound in human skin, or at least claim to be bound in human skin, are often unverified and are frequently about either religion or science. No, the heyday of anthropodermic books would come later. The early modern period, a time often called the Renaissance, brought a wave of cultural changes across Europe. And among the most significant of these changes was a shift in the dynamics of book ownership. In the Middle Ages, every book was written, letter by letter, painstakingly by hand by a scribe, and these letters were generally written on parchment or vellum made of animal hides, typically sheep, calves, and goats. Because of these, book production took a long time, and books were expensive. To give you an idea of just how much a particularly lavish book might cost, we might consider the 9th century Book of Kells, a book that, if you have never seen it, you should take a moment to do a search for some photos. It is truly an extraordinary work itself. The Book of Kells required about 150 head of cattle to make its vellum, and this doesn't account for paying the scribes and other materials like ink and gold leaf. Now, this is a particularly pricey example, but it does give an idea of just how expensive book production was during the Middle Ages. Cattle, ink, labor, all of these costs added up to be a pretty penny. But after the printing press, these things changed. Books could now be mass-produced, and to keep up with this increased speed, printers began to prefer a material that was easier to produce quickly: paper. And with this increase in production came a drop in price. Now, more people could afford to buy their own books. Even at this point, only a small slice of the population was literate, but that slice was getting bigger, and they wanted books. And so it makes a bit of sense that a significant number of the books that are purported to be bound in human skin are books written during the Renaissance. One such example is the book we discussed at the top of the episode, Barry Brooks's allegedly skin-bound book. The book inside the binding is Louis Richome's 1608 anti-Protestant polemic Les Idolâtres Huguenots. Now, I don't read French, but I have been able to track down some information about Louis Richaume himself, and what I have found is frightening. Richaume was a vehement anti-Protestant activist, and Les Idolâtres Huguenots was just one of a line of lengthy and violent works written against French Protestants. Richaume even went so far to compare Protestants to demons, monsters, and the Antichrist. And this violent language wasn't isolated. France had just emerged from its first religious war between Catholics and Protestants, and a large number of Protestant Huguenots were killed during these conflicts. Not only that, but the climate of 1608 France was well on its way to renewing armed conflict. All that to say, before we even get into the book's cover, there's already significant violence floating around this book. And make no mistake, a skin-bound book carried with it the threat of violence. While the cover's, shall we say, contributor is not identified in the book, an anti-Protestant polemic that claimed to be bound in skin carried a clear threat. The skin around the book is the skin of a Protestant. But what about this cover itself? I've had the chance to sit down with this book, and I can tell you the book's cover is about 16.5 by 11.5 centimeters. That's about 6.5 by 4 3/4 inches. It doesn't have any marks on the cover, and the only words on the book's spine are "Per le mec Huguenot par lui Richaume." In all truth, the folder of documents that Ed Frank, the curator of the University of Memphis Special Collections, handed me alongside the book that was much more interesting. You see, in 1985, the library sent a fragment of the book's cover to a dermatology professor at the University of California, San Francisco. In the folder was a letter from the professor stating that he had, quote, no doubt that the binding in question was made from human skin. And there it was, the proverbial smoking gun right in my hand, a scientifically verified example of Anthropodermic Bibliopegy. At least, it seemed that way. That is, until 2016, when the University of Memphis Library announced that new tests had shown the book's binding is, in fact, sheepskin. And this is a classic case of science marching on. The UC San Francisco professor didn't do anything dishonest or wrong. Our knowledge and technology have just grown significantly in the 30 years between the tests, and this is an objectively good thing. But there was one notable outcome that came from the announcement that surprised me and the staff at the University of Memphis libraries. A lot of people were disappointed. The book and its quote-unquote human binding, ironically, had taken on a life of its own. Students were fascinated by it. Researchers like myself were fascinated by it. A mention of the book had even made its way into the University of Memphis orientation tours for new students. As for me, it was the draw of the book's strangeness that led me to visit the library in the first place, and, in many ways, have led to the podcast you listen to today. How could the Anthropodermic Bibliopegy Huguenot be just like any other book? The students wanted to believe, and I wanted to believe. And I think it is this wish for belief that is at the core of why these false anthropodermic books are so prevalent. You see, there's not a lot about tanned human skin that looks terribly different from tanned sheepskin or pigskin. So it just takes a few words, a story, to pass off a run-of-the-mill book as something extraordinary. And when a story is this bizarre, this compelling, we want it to be true. But what does this say about us, as people, that we just might want books bound in human skin to be real? To this, I cannot give a definitive answer, but I do have an educated guess. Faux anthropodermic books rely on our views of the past, and as long as we believe the bindings are real, these views are confirmed. Of course, the Anthropodermic Bibliopegy Huguenot is real, because it confirms just how violent and savage people were 400 years ago. And of course there are books from the Middle Ages that are bound in human skin, because everything we have seen in popular media tells us this is just how people acted during the medieval times. And as long as we as people believe these false bindings are real, we don't have to adjust these thoughts and admit that the past is much more complicated than we would often like to believe. But that's not to say anthropodermic books don't exist. While the examples we looked at today tell us more about ourselves because they are fakes, there are numerous accounts of real anthropodermic bindings left to explore. Join me for episode 2 of this 2-part dive into human skin bindings as we look at some of the genuine examples of the practice. And they might just be more recent than you think.
Thanks for joining us today on The Forgotten Archive. If you've enjoyed yourself, head over to theforgottenarchive.com or anchor.fm/The Forgotten Archive and click the follow button. You can also like this show on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by searching The Forgotten Archive. Original music for this podcast is by Trip Page. You can find his music on Spotify by searching for Trip Page. That's Trip with 2 P's. I'm Landis Hosterman, and thanks for listening. Until next time, remember, sometimes a book's cover has its own story.